Hi everyone, so this is the day 13 of the 42-day revision challenge, and today we are doing indirect taxes. When we look at taxes, we divide taxes into two kinds of category. One is what we call direct taxes, and another one is what we call indirect taxes. Now, when you look at direct taxes are basically taxes on income. So, like for example, your income tax, for example, your profit tax, for example, any tax like wealth tax. All are examples of what we call direct taxes because these are taxes on the income an individual earns. On the other hand, indirect taxes are direct taxes which are paid on expenditure. So they are paid on expenditure. What do I mean by paid on expenditure? Well, paid on expenditure means that these taxes will only be paid when you do undertake a transaction. For example, I go and buy a good. Let's say buy a can of Coke. That can of Coke would have some what we call sales tax. That is when I pay for that tax. If I don't buy the good, I don't pay that tax. So the indirect taxes are basically those taxes which are on expenditure, while direct taxes are paid on expenditure. And so while direct taxes are paid on income. So our focus today is what we call on indirect taxes. And when we look at indirect taxes, we say there are two categories of indirect taxes. One is what we call specific tax. Another name for specific tax would be your per unit tax, and I want to explain this in 1 minute. And the second category is what we call ad valorem tax. Ad valorem tax is also called the value added tax, which is a percentage tax. An example of this could be, like if you are paying what we call a specific tax on a good, then this would be, let's say, a flat amount of, let's say, tax of $5. While a percentage tax would be, or a value added tax will be a tax which is, for example, a tax of, let's say, 10%. So the percentage means that the higher the amount or the higher the price that you pay for the good, the higher the value that you pay for the good, the higher will be this tax amount, because 10% of a larger number will be much more than 10% of a smaller number. On the other hand, when you look at this kind of a tax, which is a flat tax, the amount does not vary, it remains the same. So the implication on supply curves, remember we did taxes and subsidies earlier as well. So implication on supply curve will be that if you look at a specific tax, so my quantity and price, and let's also draw it here for the ad valorem as well. So the implication is simply that if this is my supply curve, and if I put a tax, my supply curve will shift backward in a parallel manner. While in this case, the supply curve, if for example is S0, my supply curve will shift backward in a non-parallel manner. Now this means that every time I look at any quantity, for example, let's say I look at Q0, and I say, okay, so what's the distance between these two supply curves? What's what we call it, the vertical distance between these two supply curves? And the answer will be it is $5. The distance is not going to change because the amount of tax is flat. So it's a flat tax. Supply curve shifts backward or upward in a parallel manner of or by $5 every time. But in this case, you can see this distance goes up, because as the price goes up, the value of the tax goes up, and the percentage tax would mean a higher percentage will have to be paid. So for example, if it's like 10% of $100, it will be $10, but 10% of $1,000 will be $100. So the higher the price, higher will be the tax percentage, higher will be the tax amount paid, because the tax rate is in a percentage form. Our next discussion is all about why government imposes taxes. So what's the reason of why government is imposing taxes? One key reason why the government imposes taxes is because it results in government to earn tax revenue. So when we'll soon see that when the government is putting indirect taxes, they earn tax revenue, and this tax revenue is very important for the government because this is the money they use to pay for public goods, for merit goods, for their expenditure, and so on. So the first reason why the government may put indirect taxes could be to earn tax revenue. The second reason we say government may want to sort of put indirect taxes would be to decrease the consumption of a good. And when we say decrease the consumption of a good, we're looking at two sort of examples. One is because the good is harmful. If you look at government putting taxes on cigarettes, it's because the good is harmful, and therefore when you put a tax, the quantity demanded goes down, and that means that we are trying to reduce the consumption of what we call consumption of demerit goods in the societies. There is a whole discussion about demerit goods in a later chapter or a later sort of video, but that demerit good means that this is a good which is causing what we call sometimes a negative externality, and it is causing a harm to the society, and because of this we are putting an indirect tax so that the consumption of this harmful good can be discouraged. The second reason within this that we say we want to put indirect taxes is on grounds of what we call reducing the consumption of what we call imported goods. So sometimes we decrease the consumption of a good which is imported. Now this imported good may not be harmful, but the fact that we are putting let's say a tax which is called a tariff sometimes on this good is because we want to reduce the consumption of foreign goods and increase the consumption of domestic goods. And this may be important for increasing employment in the domestic sector because of imported goods. Let's say we are suffering from unemployment, or because of imported goods we are suffering from even sometimes current account deficits or other sort of international trade issues, and we may want to sort of put taxes which are called tariffs sometimes so that we could sort of reduce the problem of too much imports from abroad. So two key reasons why the government may want to impose taxes. One is to earn revenue, two is to discourage the demand of certain goods, be it imported goods or harmful goods like demerit goods and so on. Our next discussion is about how indirect taxes work. So let me write this: how indirect taxes work. In other words, how will my indirect tax affect the equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity, and what are the consumer surplus before and after tax, and also what is the amount of government tax revenue. So let's assume that we are putting a tax on, for example, cigarettes, and let's say currently this is my demand and supply. I mean, demand should be more inelastic, but let's assume this is demand and supply of cigarettes, and as currently the market price is P naught and quantity is Q naught, and the government is trying to put a tax of, let's say, of $4. Also assume that the price is like $10, and let's say the quantity bought is 100. So the government is trying to put a tax on I don't know, any good, like for example cigarettes, the price is $10, the tax amount is $4. Let's see how it affects my demand and supply. So before tax, my price is P naught and quantity is Q naught, right? When you put a tax, the supply curve will shift backward, something like this. When the supply curve shifts backward, supply curve is S1, shifts backward at the new price P1, because now my supply curve is S1, my demand curve is D naught. At the new price P1, which is this, I'm going to call this price to be $12. And there's a reason why I'm saying the price will be $12. One should argue this, that like when you put a tax of $4 on a good where the price was 10, the quantity, the new price should be 14, but we are saying new price is not 14, new price is below 14, new price is actually 12. So why is that so? Look at this, guys. When your price is 12, the vertical distance between the two supply curves, this distance A and B, this vertical distance, we say this vertical distance has to be $4. Why? Because as explained earlier, the distance between the two supply curves has to be the amount of tax. So for example, if this is the new price P1, then this distance AB has to be $4, which would mean my after sort of like tax price, this should be 12 minus 4 should be 8. Now, when you're putting an indirect tax on a good, the new the first thing we'll notice is that the price of the good will rise after tax. So let me write this. Number one, after tax, you can see this, A, the price will rise. B, you can see this, the quantity sold, let's say now is 80, the quantity demanded or sold will fall. In this case, we can see that happening. And C, which is important thing to understand, is this, that when you put a tax, not all the tax will be paid by consumers. In fact, what we need to see is that what is the price before tax, what is the price after tax. So what is the price before tax? And the answer is 10. What is the price after tax? And the answer is 12, which means that the consumer is who was previously paying $10 is now only paying $12, which means the tax has affected his price by only $2. In fact, we say this, that P1 minus P naught, this distance P1 minus P naught is looking at what we call the per unit consumer burden. How much is of the $4 tax is what consumer is paying, and therefore if you look at it from a producer perspective, producer was getting $10 before, but now after tax the price goes to 12, and of the $12, 4 goes to the government, so 12 minus 4 is 8, and therefore he's now getting 8. So from a producer's perspective, the per unit burden is also the per unit producer burden is also $2. So what we say is that when you put a tax on a good, the price may not rise by the whole amount of the tax. In fact, it can rise by an amount lower than the tax that you put. So for example, 10 was the price before and now 12 rather than 14. So which means consumer ends up paying some part of the tax and producer pays another part of the tax. And the total tax is this vertical distance, which is 12 minus 8 or $4. Let's see one more thing. So the C part that I want to write is that, so first is that price will rise, we know this, to 12, quantity will fall, we know this, from 100 to 80. C is that consumer and producer may both pay some part of the tax. So some part of the tax is being paid by the consumer, another part is being paid by the producer. Right? Now, we want to look at first thing that we want to look at is basically what's the effect of an indirect tax in terms of consumer surpluses or producer surpluses, and in terms of consumer welfare and producer welfare. So, for that, let's just label each region a number. So, let's call this 1, let's call this area 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So, what our area sort of 2, let me zoom in the diagram, is basically this region. Area 2 is this region, and area 3 is this region. I'm sorry, area 5 is this region. Okay, this rectangle. So let's start. So before tax, my price was P naught, my quantity was Q naught, right? So price is P naught, quantity is Q naught, and demand curve or area under the demand curve is basically this much. So I can say this: my consumer surplus area under the demand curve above the market price of $10 is 1 plus 2 plus 3. While producer surplus, which is area under the market price above the supply curve, is area 4 plus 5 plus 6. So consumer surplus is this much, consumer surplus is this much, while producer surplus is this much. Now when you put taxes, when you put indirect taxes, let's write after taxes or after tax, my price becomes P1 and the quantity is Q1. So what's my consumer surplus? Consumer surplus will be basically this region area 1, and producer surplus will be 12 minus 8, because ultimately producer is only getting 8. So this P2 is the price the producer is getting, and not P naught, not P1. Although he may receive 12, he may give $4 to the government. So 12 minus 4 is 8, and ultimately he's pocketing $8. And because Q1 is sold, so we look at area 6 to be the new producer surplus. So where does the rest of the region go? And we say that government is also pocketing some what we call government tax revenue, and that tax revenue will be equal to this tax amount, which is P1 minus P2, P1 minus P2 times the new quantity Q1, which will be basically area 2 plus 5. So in this case, what you can see this is that the government is pocketing this region, which is 2 plus 5. What is 3 plus 4? And we argue this, that because 3 plus 4 is an area which will no longer be for any consumer and producer, we call area 3 plus 4 as a dead weight loss. Now I can explain this in 1 minute, but first let's look at our diagram again. So what we are saying is this, that when you put a tax, first of all, some part of the tax is paid by the consumer, some part of the tax is paid by the producer. Second thing we say this, that is that government also earns some tax revenue. So before indirect taxes, everything was pocketed by consumer or producer in terms of surpluses, but after taxes, area 2 and 5 are actually going to the government in terms of government tariff revenue. Consumers will have a lower surplus because now they're paying a higher price, so consumer surplus will be area 1. Producers will also have a lower surplus because now they're getting only 8 rather than $10, and they are also selling less. Therefore, area 6 is the producer surplus. Some surpluses, which is area 3 and 4, are basically what we call deadweight losses, and this happens because we are now selling a lower quantity. So some producers suffer. Area 4 is that loss of producer surplus, while price has also gone up. So some consumers also suffer, which is area 3. Now, what part of my tax is being paid by the consumer? And the answer is this area 2 is like what I call consumer burden of the tax. And I'll explain it in 1 minute. And area 5 is what we call the producer burden of the tax. Why do I say that? Let's zoom in the diagram. So look at this, guys. So if the consumer previously was paying $10, is now paying $12, this means $2 is now being paid by him. And $2 times 80 would be this area. So the total tax revenue will be paid by the consumer will be P1 minus P0 times quantity Q1, which is area 2. Similarly, producer is paying $2, which is P0 minus P0 minus P1, which is $2 times Q1, which means area 5 is the producer burden of the tax. If sometimes they ask you how much is the amount consumer is paying, or how much is the amount producer is paying, or what is the total tax liability. So total tax liability you can find out as well. So total tax revenue for the government will be P1 minus P2, as we said, times Q1, which is going to be 12 minus 8, the vertical distance, which is $4 of tax, times 80, or 4 times 80, which is equal to 8 4s 320. Of 320, we are saying area 2 is half of it, and area 5 is the other half of it. So half of 320 is basically 80 times 2, which is $160 is being paid by the producer, and $160 is being paid by the consumer, and $160 is being paid by the producer. So when the government is putting taxes, some part of the tax is paid by the consumer, some part of the tax is paid by the producer, and therefore both consumers and producers can share the burden of the tax depending on elasticity. Now, what do we mean by depending on elasticity? So our next discussion is basically role of elasticity in indirect taxes. So let me write this: role of elasticity in indirect taxes. So what is the role of elasticity when it comes to indirect taxes? Well, we say that if the good is more inelastic, we say this, that the consumer will pay a large burden of the tax. So let me write this: will pay a large burden of the tax. And the reason why this happens, I'm going to show this in a diagram as well, is that the reason why this happens is because price after tax, when the good is more inelastic, will be much more. So let me write this: will be much more after tax. In fact, if the good is perfectly inelastic, in the case of perfect inelastic demand curve, let me write this: perfectly inelastic demand curve, we will see that the consumer burden of the tax is the whole amount of the tax. So CB means consumer burden. Let me write this: CB means consumer burden, and I'm saying this, that the consumer burden of the tax will be the whole amount of the tax. So how do you show that in terms of diagram? So let me make an extreme case. First, let me just draw what we call a perfectly inelastic demand curve. So in a perfectly inelastic demand curve, we say this: the good is so important to you, it is like a life-saving drug, and therefore you are willing to pay any price for the good. So you're willing to pay any price for the good, and your demand curve as a result of this is perfectly vertical like this one. In this diagram, as you can see, the consumer will be willing to pay any price but does not change the quantity. So Q remains Q naught. Now, when you put a tax on this good, the supply curve, if previously was like, for example, S naught, and the price that we were willing to pay was, for example, P naught, after tax, the supply curve will shift to the left or upward by the amount of the tax, and the vertical distance will be S1. So the new supply curve will be S1, but look at this, what is happening, guys, that the new price is, for example, P1, where this distance AB, we said, is our vertical distance AB is the amount of the tax. So let's say if the price was $10, the amount of the tax is $4. So 10 plus 4, I reach to P1, which is 14. And this P1 14 is also my new equilibrium price. So in this case, consumer is paying the whole amount of the tax because the producer knows that this good is inelastic for the consumer. He's willing to pay any price for it. So the producer transfers the whole amount of the tax to the consumer in terms of a higher price. So when we have a demand curve which is perfectly inelastic, consumer ends up paying the whole amount of the tax, and therefore the more inelastic the demand, the higher will be the consumer burden of the tax. Another case that I want to discuss with where basically we'll see producer ends up paying the whole amount of the tax will be when demand is perfectly elastic. Now, when the demand is perfectly elastic, this is a good which we say is a good like where there's a perfect substitute available, right? So this good is one where the consumer can sort of switch to any other substitute because the substitutes are so many in the market and all of them are completely identical. So there's no brand loyalty per se in this market for any producer. So producer's position in this is weak. When you look at perfectly inelastic demand curve, we say consumer is very strong. Producer is very strong. Producer is the strongest party because he's selling what we call something as important as a life-saving drug. When you're looking at a perfectly elastic good, on the other hand, you are looking at a producer selling something where he has extreme weak position because he's selling something which has a perfect substitute available, and that's why you have a perfectly elastic demand curve. The producer can only sell at the price of $10. Now let's put a tax on this one. So if this is my supply curve S naught, and right now quantity Q naught is bought, price is P naught, so equilibrium price is P naught, which is $10. We put a tax of $4, supply curve will shift backward by the amount of the tax, so this supply curve will be S1. When you look at this supply curve, the vertical distance, of course, is the amount of the tax. So this is my new equilibrium point, and this is my new equilibrium quantity Q1. But this vertical distance AB is now the new amount of the tax. As you can see, at this point AB, this is my new equilibrium at point A, and my price has not changed, which would mean AB distance should be $4, which means 10 minus 4, we are looking at the new price to be 6. Now this new price to be 6 doesn't mean the consumer is paying $6. The consumer is paying still $10, where demand meets the new supply curve S1. Of that $10, producer gives $4 to the government. So this AB distance, or P naught minus P1, is that $4, and producer ends up pocketing $6. What we can see in these cases is this, that the price changed by the whole amount of the tax, and therefore consumer pays the whole amount of the tax. The price did not change at all before or after tax, and therefore producer pays the whole amount of the tax. And therefore we can make some conclusion about it, that if the PED of demand is 0, this means perfectly inelastic. Consumer pay the whole amount of the tax. Of the tax. And if PED is infinity, perfectly elastic, the producer will pay the tax. In fact, we can say this is that if PED is less than PES, which means demand elasticity is lower than supply elasticity, we can also say this in this case, the consumer is basically has a lower elasticity, which means he needs the good more than the producer elasticity. We can say this, that the consumer burden CB will be greater than producer burden. And I'm going to show this in a diagram as well in 1 minute. Similarly, if PED is greater than PES, which means now consumers are basically relatively more stronger than producer, more flexible than producer, then the consumer burden will be less than producer burden. Let's see a diagram here to show what we mean by this. Let's say I have a very inelastic demand but an elastic supply curve. And this comes a lot in MCQs sometimes as well. They give you a diagram like this one and they ask you who pays or who has a higher burden of the tax. So if I make a diagram like this one, this is my quantity and price. If I make a diagram like this one, where the demand curve is very kind of inelastic, but supply curve is like this one, pretty elastic curve, and I ask you who pays the tax. So without much trouble, if I have this kind of a situation, I notice that demand is more inelastic than supply, which is elastic. Clearly the case is that PED of is less than PES, and therefore consumer will pay a higher burden of the tax. So I could say this, consumer will pay a higher burden of the tax. And I can show you as well, by the way. Let's see this. Let's say if we put a tax which is causing the supply curve to shift backward from S to S dash, the price is P naught, the quantity is Q naught, the price goes to sort of P1 and the quantity goes to Q1. Look at this, guys. This is the vertical distance is basically this AB is my vertical distance. Now if I zoom this area, this is kind of like a pretty inelastic curve. You can see this, that your consumer burden is this region, the whole region is this one. This is my consumer burden of the tax, which is so much larger than the producer burden of the tax, which is this region here. And let me call this to be P2. So consumer pays P0 minus P1, which is much larger than producer who pays P0 minus P2. And therefore, this whole region is my consumer burden of the tax, which is much larger than this region, which is my producer burden of the tax. So the lower the elasticity, the higher the tax burden you will pay.